Hi, and welcome everyone to this webinar on Ecocide. My name is Hanna Wetterstrand, and I'm going to facilitate this webinar. I'm a facilitator in Time to Think. And I will guide you through this evening or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. The outline for today is that we're going to have 10 minutes presentations from each of our eminent panel participants. And then we're going to have time for all of you to ask questions and reflect on what you have heard. But before starting, I would actually like to invite you to already now start reflecting on this topic. So we'd like to share a screen with you with a question, and I will leave some nice music on for 2 minutes and ask you to write your reflections in the chat. So we're going to have a 2-minute music time, and you can please write answers to these questions in the chat. What do you most need to know about ecocide as an international crime? Please write in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for those reflections and questions. We will either have them raised in the presentation, so we will bring them up afterwards. So hopefully you will have all your questions clarified. Then I'd like to give the word to Pella Thiel, who will give the first presentation of today. She's the chairperson of Ecocide Sweden and an expert in the UN Harmony with Nature program. And she will give us an introduction to ecocide law. Welcome, Pella.
Thank you, Hanna, and great to be here. And I wanted to say something also of the context of this webinar. It's arranged within an initiative for rights of nature within the Convention on Biodiversity, which is developing a new framework this year. And it's arranged by Rights of Nature Sweden, Rights of Mother Earth, Earth Advocacy Youth, and Earth Law Center, and also the CBD Alliance. And I want to think back 75 years from this year, when the Nuremberg trials were held, when the people of highest responsibility for the atrocities committed during the Second World War were held into account in Nuremberg. And the concepts of genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity for the first time were used in a legal context for crimes that were so bad that the international community couldn't look away, even if they were committed within state sovereignty, so to speak. And this process eventually led to the creation of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where genocide and crimes against humanity are today international crimes. And I think ecocide, so what we are talking about here is to have ecocide as an international crime within the remit of the International Criminal Court as a so-called crime against peace. And in a way, ecocide is very fitting in that context, as the earth is one system, it's one living system. It doesn't care about national boundaries at all. And one of the first times that ecocide was spoken in a political context was in the Stockholm Conference back in 1972, when Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, who gathered the world to the first environmental conference on an international level, he said that the air we breathe is not the property of any one nation. We share it. The big oceans are not divided by national frontiers. They are our common property. In the field of human environment, there is no individual future, neither for humans nor for nations. And this is something that we are really now, in the time of essentially global ecological collapse, we are learning in the hard way. And since the Stockholm Conference, there has been hundreds, literally, of treaties and conventions regarding the human relationship to nature. And since the Stockholm Conference also, about 2/3 of wildlife in the world has disappeared, according to the WWF Living Planet report. So it's not like it's working. What we are doing to safeguard biodiversity isn't working. And the texts of conventions, like the Convention on Biodiversity, is really nice. But essentially, it's just nice words on a paper, because there are no sanctions. There's no accountability, no regulations relevant to the actors, often corporations, because unlike in 1972, the economy nowadays is global. So it's a global economy with the strongest and most powerful actors are corporations, and they are also the ones responsible for most damage and destruction. And actually, when the Rome Statute, which is the document that's governing the International Criminal Court, when that was developed in the 90s, ecocide was part of the discussion. So essentially, it's a missing crime. And now we all know, and it's high on the political agenda internationally, that our ecosystems are key to human well-being, and they are in grave danger. So now is the time to actually acknowledge ecocide as an international crime. And I hope that Eleanor, maybe you can talk a bit about what that would do to our governance systems.
Surely. If you'd like me to pick up the ball at that point, thank you very much, Pella, and good afternoon, everyone. Pella has very helpfully and usefully already made the link back to the Nuremberg trials and to the foundation of the International Criminal Court. And it's worth thinking for a moment, why were the Nuremberg trials necessary and why was the ICC necessary? Because, you know, murder has been a crime for a very long time. So you might have said, well, to the extent that what had happened during the course of the Second World War was lots and lots and lots of individual acts of murder, why not just prosecute for murder? And there was a very deliberate decision to handle matters differently. I want to step back and I want to speak as a very pragmatic lawyer. My trade is being a lawyer. And so, you know, I am concerned, like any good tradesman, like any good workman who has a box of tools, I'm concerned with what's in my toolkit, what's there and what can I use it for? And the toolkit of the law, in as much as it is there already to protect the environment, to try to fight against climate change, to try to protect biodiversity, the toolbox has got some tools in it, and some of them have proved useful in the particular context in which they operate, but the toolkit is lacking a complete set of tools. Very specifically, it doesn't have a really, really big tool also in the toolbox. Let me try to give you an illustration. If you have a screw that you need to undo, you need a screwdriver of the right size. Actually, nothing else will do. If the screwdriver is too big or too small, it will not undo the screw. We have in our toolbox, we have a lot of small and medium-sized screwdrivers, but we don't have a big screwdriver. We don't have the biggest screwdriver, which is the crime against peace. And just as for the Nuremberg trials, lawyers looked at it and they said, no, what has happened is so big and so bad that it needs a different response from the international community. It needs the international community to mark that it simply will not accept people behaving like this. This is repugnant, this is evil, we won't accept it. And therefore, there were the prosecutions for genocide, for crimes against humanity. And this is the equivalent. This is adding to the toolkit a new additional big crime, and adding that crime has several purposes to it. First of all, it really is a big tool to address a big problem. Secondly, if it goes into the Rome Statute, that would record publicly that the international community does not regard behavior that is ecocide as okay. On the contrary, that it regards it as something that is abhorrent and something that should be sanctioned and that will be sanctioned. Now, you know, the big tools are not there to be used every day, thank heavens, right? They are there for the reasons I've just given, but they're also there so that if needed, the existence of the crime and the real possibility that in appropriate circumstances, there will be a prosecution and there will be sanctions, that has a big effect as a deterrent. Even if the crime is not actually ever prosecuted for in the first 2 years that it's there, it still has a deterrent effect. And it is also sometimes, I'm going to say, not just that it's a deterrent, but that it is actively helpful to people who have to make choices between different policies. And for example, let's take the example of a CEO who is responsible for the conduct of his company. And he's also responsible to the shareholders, who expect to see a nice dividend on their shares. They want to see the company making a lot of profit. If you have no high-level crime, there is a lot of pressure on the CEO to take a shortcut, which may be environmentally a very bad idea, but which may be a good way of making a lot of money for the company. If, on the other hand, you have in place the big crime, that does enable the CEO to say at the board meeting, at the big discussion where they're deciding what to do, listen, guys, maybe it may look to you we could make a lot of money like that, but actually we can't do that. We cannot do that because that will be considered or may risk being considered to be ecocide, and we're just not going to go there. We're not going to take that risk. So it has a useful deterrent effect, as well as the effect if it's ever actually prosecuted. And I think that's important to stress. In terms, I was just looking at the questions in the chat very briefly while Pella was speaking to you. And, you know, in terms of how you do this, well, you would have to add this missing crime to the crimes that are already in the Rome Statute. And there is a procedure under the Rome Statute to do that. I think I can, you know, talk in more detail about the procedure if you want me to, but it's a very lawyer's procedure. I think the most important thing to say about the procedure is that any procedure for changing something in international law is a procedure where the golden rule is you need allies. You do not want to be the only country that is trying to change things. If you are, nothing is going to happen. But if there are more people, if there are more countries and you can get together, then you can get a certain momentum towards this. And of course, there was very recently a speech by the Secretary General of the United Nations emphasizing the importance, the environmental challenge and the climate change challenge. So, you know, there is, I'm going to say there is a hopeful sign because there is more awareness at the international level that these things actually matter. I'm going to stop there because I think I should, I'm sure there's more we can say later. Let me hand on, however, to Rebecka, if I may.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. So before giving Rebecka the word, I'm going to actually introduce you because we forgot that. So for those of you who didn't read the invitation to this workshop, so Eleanor Sharpston is the Queen's Chancellor, Advocate General at the Court of Justice of the European Union from 2006 until 2020. And she's also an honorary doctor at the law of law at Stockholm University. So thank you so much for those words. And now I'd like to introduce the third speaker, which is Rebecka Lomon. And she is a member of Parliament of Sweden, of the Green Party, and a founding member of the Ecocide Alliance. So welcome, Rebecka. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for taking this initiative and inviting me to this place and space. Yes, as Pella has mentioned before, we have a lot of declarations, we have plenty of goals, but we haven't reached them, and what we need is actually laws. And I have been asked to give some argues about why this is helpful for us as politicians. Me myself, I'm a conservation biologist, and I began my work in politics just when I realized how we are living in this time of mass extinction of species, but there is no actually answer for that from the politicians. Sorry. And that's why I believe in this ecocide law. And I've been working in the field in Sweden as a consultant with the current environmental laws that we have. And I think that there is many problems with that, because as soon as we have any kind of anything that we can measure, we can put a limit, and companies can operate just beneath that limit. And if we set these kind of limits of maybe how much we can pollute and how much chemicals that can be released or something like that, just underneath these limits, it's legal. You can make money on various types of extractions. That can mean actually wiping out ecosystems with overfishing, big scale loggings, big scale mining, animal industries, and so on. And that's why I think ecocide can help, because it's describe mass damage of ecosystems, not by numbers and exact limits. But then there is moral. Today, many of our moral questions has been reduced to transactions. And as long as the seller and buyer agrees, there's nothing wrong about it. In the same time, we have the climate crisis, we have the mass extinction, and we have the huge suffering of both humans and animals. That is actually the true cost of different products that we can find on legal markets. I think that if we can bring the moral responsibilities up to the table, I think we can reach much further. And for me, making ecocide a crime is a huge step in this direction. The risk of companies is no small fee, it's prison, and it's a ruined reputation. And that's the real loss for big multinational companies, to be seen as immoral criminals. I also believe that ecocide law, because it will become something international that we can recognize, but companies are already operating on a global scale, in the global market. And sometimes in the political debate, when the country wants to actually increase or make even better environmental laws, this legislation is sometimes argued to frighten the companies away and forcing them to move abroad. So this can create a race to the bottom that we are already seeing in different kinds of areas. But we should be aiming to get well inside the planetary boundaries. So an international law would really be helpful in that sense, because that's how the companies are already operating now. And then I think I see a lot of hope when it comes to the ecocide law, because much focus has been now put on the individual's shoulder. And instead of criticizing the relatively few companies who are doing this extraction, for example, oil drilling, there is more focus on the millions of people who are using cars, for example. Instead of criticizing the enormous loggings or the enormous mining, we are blaming everybody who is using paper or phones. And and this is a really hard thing to win. And we have been stuck in a blame game, and the real damage is still going on outside in the world. And we should actually put the focus on this ecocide that is ongoing. And of course, with that said, it is a big problem with the overconsumption, but it actually starts in the overproduction and the way that we are producing our stuff. So the crime is conducted with the ecocide, and I don't think it's up to the consumer to choose the right pair of avocados in the store. If an avocado is actually produced in a way that causes ecocide, it should never even be an option. So this actually eases the burden from the individual's shoulders who are doing different choices every day. And then I see a lot of hope in ecocide because there is a structure already. There is an international criminal court that exists. We know how things are, how we can have this process and how the Fifth Amendment can be added to the ecocide, to the Rome Statute with the ecocide law. So this is not something that we have to design from scratch. It's something that has been on the table from the beginning of the discussions, but then it has been forgotten for many years, and now I see that more and more people are realizing this opportunity that we have. So I also want to mention that ecocide is not even radical. Many people believe that this is because of the big scale and the international scale of it, it's utopia and it's impossible. But if we can describe this mass damage to the ecosystem and we can put it in pictures and we can have cases, nobody can actually argue to defend the ecocide. Nobody wants this ecocide to ever happen. We just have to put the responsibility where it belongs. So for me, as a biologist who got into politics because of biodiversity, I think this is much needed for all these different reasons. And with that said, I don't think it's going to be enough, but I think it's going to be a huge step into the right direction, because it will only protect us from the most extreme cases of ecocide. But I think it will be also a shift in how we think and how we see and how we can take our responsibilities, which are not taken seriously today. So, and also I want to finish off by saying that myself and my colleagues from the Green Party, together with the Social Democrats, submitted a motion to the parliament saying that Sweden should take the initiative and support ecocide as the Fifth Amendment in the Rome Statute. And also, this was something that the Left Party submitted as well. So there are many things now happening in the political field in Sweden, and I think that's really hopeful.
Good.
Thank you.
Good.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rebecka. And thank you also, Pella and Eleanor, for your clarifying and rich presentations. So now I'd like to invite everyone again for a short, quiet moment to reflect on what you've heard. And we're going to have a picture with a question here that we'd like you to reflect upon. And please write in the chat. And if you have specific questions, you write them in the Q&A section. You see there are two different icons in the bottom of the Zoom window. So we're going to have Peder putting on a picture with a question. So the next question, yes. So what are you thinking now, basically, about the presentations you've heard? Reflections you can add in the chat, and specific questions you add into the Q&A session. Thank you so much, everyone. So some of the questions are dropping in now here. So we're getting some questions regarding the general awareness and understanding of politicians in the world of this concept and the ecocide law. I don't know who should comment on that, if it's Pella. Yes.
Yeah,
That's
thank
Pella.
you. Yeah, great that so many have been asking also from the beginning. So where are we now in terms of the interest of this idea? And I would say that the idea of making ecocide as an international crime is largely unknown. We have been working with it the last 5, 6, 7 years, and the idea emanates from a British lawyer, Polly Higgins, and she has been working with it during, I don't know, 10, 15 years, and she sadly passed away recently. But this last year has been a totally different story. And I think tomorrow or the day after begins the Assembly of the State Parties of the ICC in The Hague. And last year, the Assembly of the State Parties, 2 members of the Rome Statute of the ICC came out and said, we have to discuss ecocide as an international crime. And those were Vanuatu and the Maldives. So essentially nations that have nothing to lose because they are losing their very territory. So those are perceived as allies, the small island states, and they are many. And each of them has one voice within the ICC. And also this year, the French President Macron has spoken out in favor of ecocide as a crime, and also the newly formed Belgian government has said that they want to work for ecocide as a crime. In Sweden, we are, together with Rebecka and others, we are seducing the Social Democrats because they have this great legacy since Olof Palme. And the Swedish labor movement is actually for ecocide as a crime. And essentially, I suppose they recognize that there are no jobs on a dead planet. So the support and the movement is building, and since the idea is not so well known, I think actually we don't know. I mean, maybe the support is huge. We don't know.
Excellent. Thank you, Pella. Does Eleanor or Rebecka have anything to add here?
I don't have to add to that, but I was looking at the questions and also at the Q&A and at the chat. And there were 2 issues there which I thought you might want me to pick up after perhaps Rebecka has commented on this, which are the legal nature of ecocide, and also the very interesting question about legal personality for parts of the environment and whether that will help. But I would like to come back to those 2 questions. But first, perhaps if Rebecka would like to follow on after Pella with more information.
Good idea.
Yeah, well, I can just agree with Pella, because very few people know about ecocide. I think, as I mentioned, nobody can actually defend the ecocide if you describe the mass damage made to environment. But since the knowledge is lacking, there are not so much knowledge about how the different parties actually, if they want to go further with it, or if they want to take another path. So this is something that we are trying to explore now. And well, since there is this Corona situation, it's a little bit harder to gossip and to talk with people by the coffee machine, and to learn how they are thinking and reacting on it. But time will tell, and we will have the debate in the parliament about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So now I think it's a really good time for answering the questions that you proposed, Eleanor, if you would like to repeat them as well. Thanks.
The questions I was picking up were, first of all, what is the legal nature of ecocide? And then also whether that was the first question. And the second, and I'm paraphrasing, was whether the fact that we start to give legal personality to parts of the environment, is that going to make things work better, or do we need to reset the system? Let me begin with the legal nature of ecocide. There is a first working definition out there, if you like, which is indeed the definition that was put forward by Polly Higgins. And that definition is, and I'm quoting, the extensive destruction, damage to, or loss of ecosystems of a given territory, whether by human agency or by other causes, to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been severely diminished. End of quotation. I would like to point out first about that definition. It's a very clever definition if we're thinking about biodiversity, because it speaks of peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory, but it does not define the inhabitants as being human beings. And so that itself is, I think, a very interesting and subtle point. Now, I mean, that's a proposed definition. And of course, as soon as you propose definitions, then you need to pick them apart and you say, okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? What does the other mean? So the extent of destruction, damage, or loss would obviously be something that one needed to work on and to think about. How is that going to be defined? There are places elsewhere in United Nations law, in conventions, which give you some help towards what you might mean when you say widespread or long-standing or severe. You can borrow some thinking from the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques, the ENMOD Convention. So, you know, there's other places you can look. But of course, a lot depends on exactly how you produce the definition. And in that context, I am really delighted to say that towards the end of November, on, I think, if I'm right, on the 20th of November, a group, an expert drafting panel, was put together to work on the legal definition of ecocide as a potential international crime that could sit alongside war crimes and genocide and crimes against humanity. It's a working panel, a drafting panel that's being co-chaired by two people, by Justice Florence Mumba and by a very old and very dear friend of mine who's a truly excellent lawyer, Philip Sands QC. And obviously, as that committee works, they will have, the way lawyers do, they will have to spend a lot of time and attention working out exactly which words are going into the definition and which words are being used in the supporting drafting and the explanatory memoranda and so on. This is standard lawyers' work. So you have a working definition there, which gives you a beginnings of an idea what the crime would look like. But what it would actually look like, I think we're going to have to wait until the drafting panel has completed their work. I want to move from there to the other question I picked up, which was about legal personality of parts of the environment. And there was a very famous article by a US lawyer called Do Trees Have Rights a while ago, which is part of this thinking. And you can ask, do trees have rights? Should the Grand Canyon have rights? Should a forest have rights? Should biodiversity have a right, or bits of the animal kingdom or plant kingdoms have rights? And I think the thinking is important and helpful because it helps us to move away from a very anthropomorphic, human-centric way of looking at the world. And to that extent, it is extremely important. Now, the next statement is truly a statement from a practicing lawyer. You tell me something has a right, and I will say to you, that's great, that's wonderful. How are we going to enforce that right? If the right is being infringed by a large company or by a government or by an individual, doesn't matter, how actually are we going to enforce the right? And much though I love animals, I'm going to take the example, I have 2 dogs who I dote on, I adore those dogs, and we're very, very good friends. But if my dogs have rights that are being infringed, they are not going to go to court to defend their rights. They're going to look at me, and I'm going to go to court on their behalf. And so, at least at the moment, I think we will have to work on the assumption that we can recognize rights and recognize legal personality in non-humans, but it is going to be up to us, the humans, who are going to have to act on behalf of those whose rights are being abused. And that takes you straight across to all the issues on enforcement and locus standi before the courts, and whether NGOs can bring actions, and if so, under what conditions, and whether you have to be a big NGO or you can be an ad hoc working group of concerned citizens who've seen a problem, and so on and so on. And it's a really important part of environmental law. The Aarhus Convention and everything that flows from it is really major. And the work of the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee, which is part of the UN, is also key in that regard. As for resetting the system, I hope I don't sound like too much of a coward, but my experience tells me that fundamental resets to systems are kind of difficult. Most of the time, if you want to move the law forward, you work with what you've got, you manipulate it a little bit, you're creative, you think sidewards, you say, well, it's not been used that way before, but I wonder why not. I think, let's try it, but you work with what you have and try and build on it. And usually that will get you further in terms of practical results than saying, you know what, this system is complete rubbish, we should start again. By the way, you may be right that the system is not that good, but still in practical terms, usually you get further trying to adjust and amend and improve an existing system rather than ripping it up and starting again. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I say something too on that, Hanna? Since this initiative, as I said in the beginning, it kind of emanates from an initiative to bring rights of nature into the Convention on Biodiversity. And that's exactly because I believe, or we believe, that rights of nature is the most powerful bridge that we have for resetting the system while using the strength of the system that we have. So it's a really clever way of using the strength of the legal system while totally challenging the assumption of the whole Western industrialized world that nature is just a resource, it's just objects, it's outside of people and we can use it for ourselves, but it doesn't have any rights or any needs or any value in and of itself. And so I think that's kind of the paradigm shift, and ecocide law is necessarily not a paradigm shift because it can operate from a very anthropocentric perspective. But rights of nature, as Eleanor said, they can't operate if ecocide is legal. So if I have the right to life, there has to be a crime, murder or homicide, to protect that right. And so rights of nature needs ecocide as a crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Pella, for that clarifying input. So I've collected a few questions here that I'd like to raise at the same time, and then you can choose among yourselves who to respond to this. So we have questions on how big of a destruction does it need to be considered a crime? You touched a little bit upon this, maybe, Eleanor, and then the second one, can it be implemented step by step, or is it not until everything is implemented that you can actually start practicing it? So anyone who would like to answer that, how big of a destruction does it need to be considered a crime? Eleanor, would you have any inputs to that? And also if it can be implemented step by step, or it needs to be taken as a whole?
If I start with your second question, in order to have something as a crime, you have to have certain fundamental elements which are there. You need to decide what kind of act or acts will constitute the crime. So what the act is, for example, destruction, what degree of severity, for example, widespread destruction. And you also need to decide things like whether you need to intend to cause the damage. So you need what the lawyers call mens rea, a guilty mind, or whether it's enough that you cause the damage, whether you intended to cause it or not. So, you know, there are some core elements. That's not an exhaustive list, by the way, it's illustrative. There are some core elements you have to get down and put down there. And that for the very good reason that criminal law is a very powerful weapon. It is the state saying, you must not do this, and we punish you if you do it. And so for very good reasons, elsewhere in the law, and I'm thinking here of the European Convention of Human Rights, elsewhere in the law, there are requirements that for criminal law to be able to be used to prosecute and to punish, it has to satisfy certain standards. It has to be precise and clear enough, and people have to know that that is the law. And by the way, it also cannot be retroactive. You can't be punished later for something which wasn't a crime when you did it. So those are basic rules about criminal law, which have to be respected. Now, I mean, you can always, of course, have a first go at a law and then amend or refine it. That is much easier in a national context than in an international context, because in a national context, if you put a law onto the statute book, if you make something a crime, and then you realize that maybe you didn't get the drafting exactly right, it is relatively easy to change the drafting. In an international context, it is a long and elaborate process to get something put onto the statute book. And so it is on the whole worth the time it takes to spend a bit more time on the drafting and try to be more comfortable that you've actually got what you need before you start to push to get that onto the statute book. Which is why, as I said a few moments ago, I am so pleased that there is an expert drafting panel that is now working on elaborating a potential definition with all the rigor that is needed of this. That was the second question. You're going to have to remind me what the first element was. I'm sorry. The bandwidth was doing some strange things and I didn't catch it properly.
Oh, sorry. Now I lost the question as well. Was it the one on step by step or the one on...
That was step by step that I just did.
Yes.
The other question was?
Sorry, I have to look it up here. There's I was
no problem.
Going through to find the other one here. Oh, sorry, I cannot find it now.
How big it was? How big of a destruction?
Thanks, exactly.
Oh, thank you indeed, Rebecka. Thank you very much for that. In terms of how big the destruction is or would need to be, I mentioned an example that already exists. If you talk about extensive destruction or widespread destruction, actually in the Rome Statute already, already sitting there in relation to war crimes, there is a definition of damage to the environment. That definition is in Article 8, para 2, little b, under 4. And what it does is to criminalize, and again I quote, widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. Now, already there you have a good illustration of how law does a balance, because that definition accepts that if you're in the middle of a war and you're busy firing high explosives around the place, you are going to cause some damage to the environment. There's no way of firing artillery and dropping bombs that doesn't damage the environment as well as people. But what that definition does is that it criminalizes widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive. And then you say, okay, how do you interpret those words widespread, long-lasting, or severe? And that is where you would go across, for example, to another UN convention, which is a 1977 convention, the ENMOD convention. And that convention gives you some definitions for those terms, for widespread, for long-lasting, and severe. It defines widespread as encompassing an area on the scale of several hundred square kilometers, so big, right? Long-lasting is defined as lasting for a period of months or approximately a season. And severe is defined as involving serious or significant disruption or harm to human life, natural and economic resources, or other assets, which of course ties across to the point that Pella was making earlier, that the real reset is in recognizing that biodiversity and the world are not just there as assets for the humans, but actually they have an importance in their own right, and they should have rights in their own right. So, you know, if you are writing a new crime of ecocide, what does any lawyer do? You look around, you see what's out there already, yes? And then looking at what's there already, but also, if you like, looking with a new set of spectacles, that you are now thinking about nature having rights, not merely about side effects on assets. You put your new spectacles on your nose and you say, right, now what do we need to change? What do we need to amplify? What do we need to tweak slightly? What do we need to be more precise about in order to get to where we want to be with this new law? And that is what the drafting committee needs to do.
Excellent, thank you. I see that I have a colleague here writing a question that is like, I think he's actually from the CBD Alliance, which represents a group of NGOs that work with the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I'm just going to write out his comment and question. I would like to understand how the recognition of rights can compete with the rights or permits given to exploit resources. Also, some are concerned how the recognition of ecocide as a crime could fire back other important rights, including the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Also, who can really speak on behalf of nature? You touched upon this, but just anyone or the people living in the territory? I imagine that should be part of the whole structure of ecocide. So Eleanor or Pella or Rebecka, if you have any comments on that. Maybe I at the same time also take this question because it's such a short time left. A lot of people want to know who are our allies in this and how can we package this huge, beautiful screwdriver to make it look and feel irresistible.
Give it a Christmas wrapping and tie a bow around its neck. To be less flippant, let me try to begin, but others will do better than I do, to answer those questions. There is something very important about recognizing rights, and that is the fact that if a right is recognized, it stands a chance of impacting earlier in the process. For example, people have rights in relation to their houses and their environment. That has an impact on planning law. It means if somebody comes along and asks to obtain a permit to do something, the body which is considering granting the permit automatically looks at the question of whether my rights as a neighbor are going to be affected, and if so, how badly. In other words, the fact the right is there means that it enters upstream of the grant of the permit, and hence the damage that may be done under the permit. If the right doesn't exist, you find yourself fighting the guy who's got the permit and who is doing the damage, and you are coming along afterwards and saying, wait, no, stop, don't do that because, yes? And so again, this is practical lawyering, I'm saying to you. It makes a difference like that, and that's already important. But please, there may be others who would like to follow on.
Pella?
Well, yeah, so I am not a lawyer, I'm an ecologist like Rebecka, but I think that laws are, they enable things and they protect things. And laws today, they protect profit and they enable destruction. And that's why we are sitting here discussing ecocide as a crime, because we have to shift that. Laws have to protect the life. They have to protect the ecosystem's nature, that is kind of our larger body, and they have to protect indigenous peoples and the defendants of ecosystems and local communities. But today they protect those who have the rights to exploit, and that's kind of what we are shifting here. And how do we package that beautiful big screwdriver? Well, actually, I think one thing that we have to do is to have the vision that we can do better, that it's possible to have a human system that lives in harmony with nature, that we can govern ourselves in that way, and that we can have a business also which is regenerative, that works with nature, not against nature. And so we want to work with business to say that actually business needs better rules to function in a way that respects the earth. And we believe that a lot of business people also recognize that. So that's kind of the package we are working with, among others, in End Ecocide Sweden.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pella. Rebecka, would you like to say some finalizing words?
Well, I'm not sure of what I can add, but I think that we have been as humans really like we are living and consuming like we have 4 planets at least, and I think it's time that we also take responsibility. And when we talk about rights, there is also a duty to that. And we live in a time when the liberalism is working for the economy and the big companies, but actually we have borders, and we have only one planet, and that's within these planetary boundaries that we have to adapt and to operate within.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think those were really nice last words. Unless, Eleanor, would you also like to say some closing words? No. Okay, thank you so much. I think this hour was really valuable and interesting, hopefully, to all of you who joined. Thank you so much for your attention and your great questions and reflections.
Thank you, Hanna. And just one thing, tomorrow, for those of you who are really intrigued now by ecocide as a crime, is an official side event to the ICC with Philip Sands, who Eleanor mentioned, who's leading the drafting panel, and others. I put the link in the chat. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Men då stänger jag. Then I close this webinar, right?
Yes.
Thank you. You've been fantastic, all of you.
I stay on a little bit.
Okay.